Looking good, looking like folks are connected to audio. It is great to see you. Welcome. Thank you for joining. I'm Xiomara. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the founder and CEO at Promise 54. And I'm so excited to welcome you all into this space. It is undeniable that resistance and backlash to equity work in this country is increasing, much of it from radical conservatives looking to derail our work toward justice and liberation. The most recent Supreme Court decisions being, of course, among the latest in this ongoing trend. The trend, though, of course, is not a surprise because we've seen these predictable waves of resistance and backlash over time throughout our nation's history. And our work continues despite the distractions and the setbacks because it must. But a lot of this work happens on the backs of Black and Brown leaders who have themselves worked their way into positions of influence up and through the very same flawed institutions and systems that were built to inhibit their success. So this Headwinds series that we've launched is designed to be an intimate, organic, 4-part series of conversations with some of those very BIPOC leaders who are working to advance educational equity and racial justice amidst significant resistance and backlash and increasing socio-political and cultural headwinds. Our hope is to support and amplify their work and to provide an opportunity for all of us to be able to find each other in the midst of all this and be able to support each other in our ongoing fight toward justice. In today's discussion, which I'm so excited about, we're going to have the opportunity to engage with a truly badass group of Black and Brown senior leaders, Frances, Shruti, Lindsay, and Margarita, who are on the inside at various philanthropic organizations. We'll get to hear what they're seeing at this time, whether their work to fuel equity is getting harder and how, what advice they have for the rest of us who are out here continuing to fight toward racial justice and broader equity in this time. To guide us in this discussion, I am so excited to introduce Reverend Dr. Daryl Ann Lifang, who is the Senior Director of Transformation Support at UNCF. We are so lucky to get to work with Daryl Ann regularly through some of our higher education work at Promise 54, and we are so excited that she has generously agreed to facilitate this discussion today. So Daryl Ann, over to you to introduce yourself and get us going.
Thank you so much, Xiomara. It is a privilege and an honor to be selected to be a part of this highly esteemed panel of guests and conversationalists. As introduced previously, my name is Reverend Dr. Daryl Ann Lifang, aka DALF. That's what they call me in this office at United Negro College Fund. I am here by mistake. And I say that because this was not my intended path. My intended path was filled with uncertainty and confusion. I came here at UNCF just simply to find a job. I stayed here at UNCF because it has become my mission and my ministry to support HBCUs and other organizations that serve Black students to ultimately see us being resilient and thriving in the future. How we do that now will dictate the level of success that we have for the members of our community. It is my goal that when I leave this earth, that I leave this earth better, stronger, and able to sustain itself beyond the realities that we see right now. And I believe that this panel that you see before us have either a similar testimony or one that is so strong and rooted into their community that they will be able to speak about their resilience and their spaces of strength. At this time, I would invite our panel to introduce themselves the best way they see fit. I will first turn it over to Margarita to give an introduction of herself.
Thank you. I'm Margarita Flores Vasconcelos. I am a former teacher, former principal, former systems leader. I'm a mother and a daughter. I'm a wife. I come from corn and epazote, cazuelas of freshly cooked food. I am from the heartache of mariachis and the gritos of our pueblo. I come from women warriors who carry the blood of stolen women from native land. And the sun keeps our skin from hiding who we really are. I am the managing director of the Crankstart Foundation. We are fast and nimble. We get money out the door. I lead a team of 8 staff members with an annual giving budget of $200 million. We are lean and we are mighty.
Ooh,
Francis?
thank you, Margarita. That is outstanding. We'll now turn it over to Lindsay.
Of course, I was like, I don't want to follow that. Hi, y'all. I'm Lindsay Hill. I am actually both in the midst of a sabbatical, which I'll talk about a little bit later during the How Are We Caring for Ourselves question, and on vacation with all of my family. So I am joining you from a parking lot outside of the High Desert Museum in Central Oregon. I am a mother of 4, ages 4 through 15. I am a new-ish steward of 40 acres, mostly forested, on the land of the Coast Salish people, just outside of Mount Vernon, Washington. I am a former teacher. I'm a former coach. I'm a former executive director of a nonprofit, and I still say deeply uncomfortable in philanthropy. My role is co-CEO of Threshold Philanthropy, based out of Seattle, Washington, on Duwamish, Muckleshoot, and Coast Salish land. And I am also a daughter, a sister, a proud auntie, and really trying to lean into my purpose, which feels both in breaking cycles of trauma within my own family lineage, but also really helping us kind of reckon with the moment that we're in as a species and on this planet. So I will stop there. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Wow, thank you so much for your honesty and your transparency, Lindsay. And certainly not least, Francis. We welcome you to the floor.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Francis Misano, and I am a Latina first-generation college graduate and daughter of a Colombian immigrant, Ana, who was undocumented in this country for 8 years. And I'm also the daughter of an Italian father, Paul, who grew up in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and never had access to educational opportunity. I was raised in the working class community of Coney Island, Brooklyn, and I am the first daughter of a firstborn daughter of a firstborn daughter, and that lineage brings me incredible strength. And my work in education is a tribute to my mother, Ana Nelsi, who became a paraprofessional, went to college on nights and weekends as my sister and I got older, and eventually became a kindergarten teacher. And so through my work, I'm paying it forward for the sacrifices that my mom made, that my parents made, but also for all of the nonprofits that deeply believed in me and provided me with opportunity. And those organizations were Prep for Prep, SEO, and MLT that helped me to be in kind of rooms like this and in roles like the ones I have now. But what those experiences taught me how to do was to be a bridger and a translator across worlds and experiences. And what I try to do is use that superpower to be an in-system activist for change. I am coming to marriage and motherhood leader in life. And for a long time, that felt like an ism, another ism that I have been facing. But now I am a wife to Maurice and a bonus mom to Maurice Jr., Desi, and Danny. And they're attending one of the schools in our portfolio at New Schools, because I think it's really important that we are helping to create schools that we would be willing to send our own kids to. Another thing to know about me is that music is incredibly important. It is my culture. It is the salsa dancing that I grew up doing in my family living room. And it's the singing that I've done in countless choirs and cover bands. Singing is my form of self-expression. It's one of the ways that I remind myself that I'm free. So in my day-to-day job, I am the CEO of New Schools Venture Fund, and we give about $45 million out in annual giving. Thank you.
Ooh, thank you. So as you can hear, we are in the midst of greatness. And so I count myself privileged to sit here and speak to all of you ladies. So thank you for joining us. I would like to tell our listeners that this is meant to be a conversation. If you have questions for our panel, please place it in the chat so that you can also be a part of the conversation, but also to get your questions answered. Thank you. So let's jump right in, ladies. Are you ready? Okay, so the first question I am going to throw at Lindsay, if possible. This question is talking about historically, Lindsay, right? How do you think philanthropy accelerated or inhibited progress toward equity in other moments of resistance? And how can those past learnings inform what to do or not to do right now?
Great question. And I'm going to start by going back and up. I think it's really important to acknowledge anytime we're having a conversation about philanthropy, that it was not designed to solve social issues. It was not designed to get at root causes. It was not designed to shift power. It was not designed to support equity. So all of the things that I know all of you on this call are working toward, fighting for it, and asking philanthropy to do, this system was not only not designed to do, but it was actually designed to perpetuate the exact underlying systems that reinforce our oppression. Mm-hmm. And I say that because I think a lot of people think of philanthropy as a net positive. And then from my work and being an insider, I was at the Rakes Foundation before this, managing the K-12 education portfolio, and then as the director of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The amount of struggle that BIPOC folks are doing in traditional white foundations is mind-blowing. Mm-hmm. And that's not just because, again, the system was built this way, but because a lot of the families who are launching these family foundations were the winners of this system, benefited from this system, and have very different ideas. You know, there's a phrase, if you've worked for one family foundation, or if you know one family foundation, you know one family foundation. Because each family's reason for launching a foundation is different. Their approach is different. What they focus on is different. And as their lives change, their ideas about giving change. Mm-hmm. And so again, I think that makes our sector even more complex and challenging. And I really want to elevate the folks who are working within these institutions in order to shift, because it is not only dehumanizing at times, but I think can reinforce our own trauma. So I just want to name that. There's a book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, that I was encouraged to read before I entered the sector. And I think that highlights a couple instances of, you know, going back to the civil rights movement, where the Ford Foundation actually did not only not show up to support civil rights, but was funding in ways that were, again, perpetuating the status quo and actually making it harder for movement leaders to do the good work in that moment. You know, I want to really kind of take us back to 2020, and I'll speak to, again, the institution that I was in. This was a period where you saw a lot of foundations tweeting out the right things, putting out statements, and even putting large numbers of dollars into special funds or special projects. And there was no systems level analysis of what was happening. There was no root cause analysis of how we got here. And there was no genuine commitment to be in this work for the long term. And so what did we see? We saw those funds dry up. We actually saw a lot of those dollars not even reach frontline communities and movement leaders. And we saw philanthropy patting itself on the back and saying, look, we did it. We showed up in this moment. And so I think that the way for philanthropy to actually approach this work from a much more authentic and effective mindset is first to do the work, and we talk about this at Threshold Philanthropy all the time, our own wealth work. Where did the money from our foundation come from? And again, I know I'm speaking much more specifically to family foundations, and others can speak from a different perspective. But if the institution, the family, has not done that work of where did my wealth come from, what's my wealth story, and what's the harm that our family has caused, It is really hard to do good work in the world. Again, I think then a real deep understanding of history and context and root causes. How did we get here? Philanthropy doesn't want to talk about capitalism. And we can't talk about racial justice. We can't talk about economic justice. We can't talk about every form of justice if we don't talk about racialized capitalism in our society. And so the foundations that I think are actually producing are actually willing to move nimbly and quickly and follow those on the ground are those who've done that internal work. They actually understand how they need to continue to grow and evolve. They have a much better analysis of what's happening in the world. And then they're courageous enough to say, we're not going to try to stay neutral. A lot of times the left-leaning foundations think they can remain neutral. And we at Threshold say there's no neutral. Neutral perpetuates the status quo. And so how do we actually boldly and courageously say this work is about shifting power? This work is about dismantling systems, as systems that we have, again, benefited from. So I'll stop there. I don't even know if I answered your question, but I would say that historically philanthropy has hindered movements because it's not bringing this internal awareness, the structural analysis, and understanding of history, and the courage required to actually follow those on the ground and be led, as opposed to thinking, we're the smartest people in the world, we have all the answers, and this is what we think.
Yeah. I think Stephanie Waller put in the chat that she was discussing with a colleague allyship fatigue, right? We know 2020 brought on a whole bunch of funding in the BIPOC community, but that was not based on actual change, right? A change in mindset, a change in the scope of how things are. It was more things happened and organizations and foundations decided let's throw money at it and let's see if that resolves it. Frances, what are your thoughts on the past learnings and how that informed philanthropy?
Yeah, I mean, so yes to everything you just said, Lindsay. And I think there's really something important just to underscore that post George Floyd, what we saw a lot was intentions to give, but not necessarily the giving. We saw a lot of proclamations and blog posts, but not significant dollars that were going out in different ways. And I think one of the things that I just want to underscore from Lindsay's point was the kinds of shifts that we need to see in philanthropy is one that's rooted in trust. And one that is rooted in the idea that the best ideas are out in the world. The best ideas are following the courageous leadership of people who are on the front lines of fighting for justice in their communities and decentering the foundations themselves, the staff members of foundations, right? And I think the way that we're set up right now in philanthropy is that we're saying we have the best ideas. We're going to come up with strategies. We're going to come up with theories of change. We're going to do all the landscape analyses, and we're going to say, here's how money needs to be allocated according to how we see the world. And the kinds of shifts that we need to do is to say, how might our experiences be different than the experiences that someone is having every single day as they're facing the injustice and the inequities, right? And what is it that they are saying that they most need? And how do we funnel money to those core causes, but also to those leaders, right? And so the reason why I say that is because we're in a place where we have to redefine our definition of expertise in philanthropy. We have to redefine who a leader is and who is worthy of investment. And until we've kind of done that kind of critical analysis, expand our view of strong ways of driving change, we're going to continue to replicate the kind of same results and the same outcomes that we've always seen, which is one where, kind of certain folks get to decide, get to impose approaches and strategies. And then communities are here going like, but what if this doesn't work for me, right? And we have to shift the way that we're doing this work. And so to me, it comes down to valuing leadership in a different kind of way, trusting that leadership, providing them with the kind of general operating support over longer periods of time to allow that work to happen. And I think we're in this place where as I kind of look at where we are in philanthropy right now, like a few years ago, we got to the point where it's like, okay, we know we have to say something about racial inequity, but that pressure is gone. And now it's kind of like, oh, well, we can't talk about that at all. And so like, we're at this point right now where, you know, there are some leaders who are going deeper on this topic, but also doing it anonymously, right? In terms of how they're funding and how they're thinking about the work ahead. And we aren't speaking as boldly and as loudly as we need to, right? I have some other thoughts on this, to your point on neutrality, but maybe we can come back to, because what I find as an intermediate organization, sometimes I have my grantees who are doing really important equity work who are like, I can't take your money if you're bolder and if you say more and you go further, right? And so I think there's a real conversation that we need to have too in philanthropy right now, which is to say, how do we make sure we focus on the outcomes of racial equity and maybe move a little bit practically and pragmatically in this next period so that we can hold on to the change that we need to see, but understand that there might be some compromises that we have to have along the way. I don't know, Lindsay, we might differ on this point, but I look forward to exploring it a bit more and maybe debating on it.
And the question I have is, who determines the outcomes, right? So a lot of times philanthropy tries to determine the outcomes when they're not communicating with the institutions to determine if it was even realistic or not. So how do we then determine what those outcomes are? And I saw that, Margarita, you had your hand up.
I mean, you know, one of the main reasons I came into philanthropy in the first place was because of this outcomes piece. And that I found myself leading a school that, while great and with really strong outcomes, was not the school I intended to lead. Because it was philanthropy and funders that were defining success metrics for me, not really me, not really our families. And so I wanted to change that. I think, you know, pulling on this thread that Frances started on, I think it's important to consider that not all philanthropy spaces are the same. And that for me, moving out of the education philanthropy space has done so much for my own health and perspective. I was putting my body and health on the line, trying to push to new heights around equity and justice in education philanthropic giving, only to realize that my ceilings were actually the floor in other places. I remember sitting down with who became my boss in an interview and really testing some things. And with every question, she was like, we already do that. I was like, well, what about endowment? She's like, we do endowments. Well, what about general operating? We should be doing more general operating. She's like, at least 70% of our grant dollars of like $250 million are unrestricted. I was like, okay, multi-year, you know, and I just, everything was just like, we do that already. We do that already. And so I think it's wise to get out and learn from, now we are not a community-based foundation, but to learn from community-based foundations and foundations working in spaces like climate and environment, working in spaces like power building. So learn from networks like the Solidaire Network. Learn from people like Dr. Carmen Rojas at Margaret Casey Foundation, or the Latino Community Foundation, who has actually mobilized, like has changed the definition of who can give and how we can give, right? They have the largest, they've been able to mobilize over 500 members in their Latino giving circle. And so I think for me, you know, I think to this point of like who's doing this work and where we can learn is really important, and to also move out of this way of like, or move out of the space of like, we believe we have the answer, right? Like part of this is like being humble enough to say there are other people potentially doing it better. And going out and figuring out what that is, even if it's in a space that is not where you have been working and living in for decades, right? And I think the other piece around this, I would say, is like, in my opinion, it's much harder to reform and redesign, because what we're being asked to do continuously is redesign a system that is broken. I personally have always found it easier to start from the ground up, to show what's possible and move people over to a new way of being and operating. But it's kind of only because I've been burned out by the constant reform and redesign.
Wow. I think that's real, especially post-COVID. It's like when you look at any sectors, people are saying they are constantly burned out. But added to that, when you're working in a sector that is predominantly a very Eurocentric space, and you're trying to do racial equity work in a very Eurocentric space, I could imagine the mental and emotional burnout that each of you are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. So let's take it from the historical space to the current, like the right now, what is happening. Francis, what are you seeing in philanthropy right now in the midst of, oh my goodness, all the things that's happening, Supreme Court, and just everything that's happening with the decisions that's being made in our systems today? Where do you see philanthropy? What are the trends?
Yeah, I mean, and you know, Margarita, I think you raise an important point, because each one of us is speaking about philanthropy from our own lenses, right? And so maybe one of the things that we can do is define the lens that we're, you know, or the lane that we're operating in that's informing our view. You know, I'm an intermediary organization. So what that means is I raise money largely from large institutional education funders. They are giving me money to allocate across my strategy. But once I have that money, and once I've kind of quote unquote made the case for how that money is going to be used, I have tons of degrees of freedom in how we're allocating that money, who we're allocating that money to. And we are actively working to share and shift power across all of our investment areas, right? So my lens when I talk is what I'm seeing and understanding from large education, largely institutional funders. And then what we're doing, right? And where we might see resistance and support. You know, I think a lot of this, Dr. Dow, I'm going to go with that. You know, I've kind of shared some of what I'm seeing. Like I see a lot of money that has been sitting on the sidelines that I do not think is going to get fully allocated towards racial equity efforts. I see a continued questioning about how to put that money to work, towards what ends, towards what purposes, right? I think when it comes to conversations about racial equity, we say the word, but we don't always know what we mean. And I think, you know, for us, it's been so important to have a clear definition, and there isn't a clear definition. And I think we too often have shorthand amongst each other where it's like, what are you actually talking about? And what can I rely on you to do, right? So like I'd say for us at New Schools, we're very focused on defining equity as we got to break the fact that it is predictable who is going to succeed in our education system by race, by socioeconomic status, by language ability, right? By ability, right? We got to break that. We got to break that, right? So that is equity at its core, right? We need to make sure the people that we're funding, right, we're expanding access to who gets to be an entrepreneur, that we are supporting leaders of color who are coming up with ideas to support their own communities, view their communities as assets, and are thinking about solutions that's going to help those young people to realize their full potential. So equity is at the center of their models. And we're expanding access, as I was saying, to who gets to be an entrepreneur, who gets to lead, who gets to innovate, right? But sometimes when we use these words, we're not always defining it, right? And I think that's something we have to do as well. And what I find is in philanthropy, we're saying the words, but we don't have the definition. What are we trying to solve? With the culture wars that have been coming up, I think there's been a resistance to engage, right? And you know, on one hand, for the philanthropists I see getting more involved on this topic, they don't want their names to be the headlines. They want to make sure they're supporting the work and are in the fights and supporting both teachers, librarians, students, right, to make a case for why we need to make sure that we are focused on culturally competent work that's going to help support young people of color and all kids of color in communities across this country, right? But again, this is a very small group where I see the majority of folks having money sitting on the sidelines, and there's almost a retrenchment. And I think we've lost some ground in terms of racial equities being a core priority.
Margarita, your thoughts or on the trends of what you're seeing happening now. And I love the idea of putting it in the lens of how you're seeing it.
Sure. Prankster we are small as in terms of staff. We are big in terms of resources. And that is by design. That is on purpose. So we are a family foundation based in San Francisco with an annual giving budget of 250 million. Most of our giving is focused on the Bay Area with the exception, actually in San Francisco and Oakland. We do some giving in Chicago, and our democracy work is national. Our board is very active. We are in close relationship with them. They review, and Prankster is relatively new. The family has been giving for decades, but Prankster as an institution or as a foundation has existed only for about 3 years. And they are the ones behind the design of keeping Prankster very small. When I came to Prankster a year and a half ago, the team was 3 people. 3 people were getting out $250 million. So by design, the reason for that is because there's the bureaucracy gets moved away, right? You have to get money out of the door quickly and get out of the way. So going to that question of like trends or the Supreme Court, I think for far too long, we are continuously like being responsive and being reactive to what comes down. And so something that is recent for us is we've begun to think about, okay, so like we can respond. So when Roe v. Wade was struck down, we didn't have reproductive justice as a giving area, and we stood work up to be able to provide and actually on the notion of like neutrality, developed a strategy, and our public purpose for these grants were to provide practical and financial access to abortions.
Mm-hmm.
People asked us whether we wanted to put abortion on our website and do all that. And we said, yes, that is what we are doing. And we know that is political. We're not hiding from that. So we did that as a responsive. We've been looking forward to, in talking to many of our immigration partners, it is likely that DACA will be struck down in 2025. And this is something that is really top of mind for the hundreds of thousands of DACA recipients in our country that will lose their status. And that will have a tremendous economic impact and also like moral impact. And so we, for us, we, in this sort of, we went out and we talked to a lot of the leaders in this space. We also talked to DACA recipients themselves, dreamers, to understand their experience, what was keeping them up at night, and what we might be able to do with philanthropic capital. That's how we kind of think about it, is like, is there something we can win on? Can we solve something? And what is the discrete problem we can go after? And so we've just developed an initiative to be able to transition at half of Bay Area DACA recipients into legal permanence. So over the next few years, we are going to be working on standing up infrastructure to be able to do that. It will also widen pathways for undocumented folks that are not DACA recipients to be able to seek legal permanence in this country. But that, I share that simply to say, like, it's not to say that whatever happens over the next few years doesn't matter, but like, we've got to look ahead. Otherwise, we're continuously going to be losing and just reacting and responding. And so I think that is something that on the conservative side of philanthropy, they have won at. Like, they have been really good at playing the long game. And I am trying to, at Prankster, get us thinking about what are some of these short-term things we can be doing while we also go after long-term plays that are going to take years, things that are not sexy, like standing up, legal clinics and federal advocacy. Like, that's not really sexy because it doesn't give you the people, it doesn't give you the numbers, right? Mm-hmm. But if we don't think long-term, we're going to continuously be losing. in my perspective.
Wow. Lindsay, when you hear thinking long term and thinking about playing the understanding the end game, right? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and to back up, just to name, we fund in Washington State, as folks across the country call us, and in the Carolinas. And we fund in the Carolinas because our founding funder, Beth McCaw, her family actually came over from Europe before the Revolutionary War. And so she acknowledges that the only reason their wealth comes from Jan, her husband's gaming tech career. But the wealth that she had only came because her family was directly responsible in removing people from their land. And while they did not own enslaved people, they had day laborers, which we all know what that meant at that time. And so again, going back to where we fund and why, we fund in the regions where their families have caused the most harm and perpetuated inequities. In Washington State, we are 2 years old. We're kind of a baby, toddlering around right now. We didn't come in with funding areas. It wasn't like a kind of traditional family foundation where folks were like, I care about education for this reason. And so we actually started with a year-long listening tour. And we engaged folks in a way that we called learning fellowships. We compensated people for their time, and folks really co-created our strategies with us. And going to this question of long term, what we kept hearing in Washington was exactly what you're saying. No progressive movement is looking down the road farther than the next election cycle. And even though Washington is more of a progressive state, there have been some key shifts and Al-Anon presence and other kind of shocking things happening. And so we then actually gathered a group of BIPOC women-led progressive power building organizations. And we said, y'all tell us, like, what's the play here? What do we need to do? And their request was for a collective visioning table for 15 years. Like, actually invest in us over a decade. Wow. And let us see what we can build together. And each one has kind of, sub areas they care about: education, housing, economic justice, et cetera. But they're like, but if we're not collectively focused on shifting power in our state over the course of the next 2 decades, none of those smaller areas matter, actually. And no other funder was creating space for this kind of long-term thinking and this long-term collaboration. And oftentimes these were the organizations that had been so pitted against each other historically. Honestly, at first, there were some organizations who were like, I won't sit at the table with that person. Even though, again, where we're headed and our vision is actually aligned, the harmful impacts of the way that funding had been distributed in our state had pitted folks against each other to such a degree that there was actually a need for healing and repair within and among our partners, even before we could do the actual strategy work, right? Mm-hmm. And so as a part of that, we've hired them a facilitator. They, again, in the first year, like, it was about trust building. It was about alignment. It was about healing. It was about repair. They are engaging in a collective landscape analysis, and they were able to get some of those quick wins. They actually realized, oh, in this next election cycle, we're in these same districts. Let's actually work together on a phone bank, or let's work together to elevate this candidate. And that builds trust. It's not just in conversations around a table that builds trust, but actually doing the work together in a different way and being funded collectively in a different way. So that's how we think about, again, our orientation is we don't come in with any ideas. We ask folks on the ground, what are you seeing and how do you think we should show up as a new funder in this space? We always ask, what are other foundations too afraid to fund? And we want to lean in there then, because I do think there's a spectrum in philanthropy. And I think we have a privilege and a responsibility to actually be on the more radical end because our family is willing to do that. And I think that creates space and cover for other foundations to say, well, look what they're doing over there. Look what Crankstart's doing. Look what Threshold is doing. we could move this way. And it kind of normalizes it for funders who are a little more afraid to be bold in this way. So we always start with, what are y'all seeing? You're the experts, not us. We're going to compensate you for your time to actually help us co-create this strategy. And then we're in it with you for the long term. The other thing I'll say that has been really important to us, we think about our funding through, again, we don't have like concrete funding buckets, but we think about individuals, organizations, and ecosystems. And we do that because oftentimes all of the funding goes to nonprofits, to individual organizations. But we know that there are real humans that are within those organizations. And honestly, some of the folks doing the most innovative work that's building this world we all know is possible, they're never going to start a 501c3. And they shouldn't. And we shouldn't be forcing them as philanthropy. And so how do we normalize actually giving to individuals directly is something we're really interested in. And then again, how are we funding and looking to broader ecosystems so that we can understand how organizations are positioned relative to each other? And we know we're not perpetuating unintentional consequences in our funding because we're actually taking that ecosystem level view. So when our partners have asked for long-term, we go there with a group of Black and Native women that we're funding directly as individuals. We called it a 1-year pilot, and they came back to us and they're like, we need 3 years. The first year is like actually just helping us stabilize as people and heal. The next year, you know, I won't go into the whole strategy, but that was an example of where we came in thinking, oh, this is a pilot, we'll learn. And they're like, and we're going to tell you now where you're going. And we were like, great, let us figure out with our lawyers how to make that work. So listening, learning, and then absolutely funding the long term, because, you know, the right has been doing this. This is why we're seeing all of these cases in this moment.
Yeah. 2 key words jumped out at me, which is trust and fear, right? So Margarita, I'm going to ask you to focus on that first word, trust, from the inside, looking out at different organizations that want to build relationships amongst each other, and also with philanthropists. How would you recommend that we help build trust in our community, as well as trust with philanthropy?
Dr. Duff, just to make sure I'm understanding the questions, how, like what our role is in enabling trust to be built externally from us?
Yes.
You know, I think, so this is the tricky piece of like, from a philanthropic standpoint, part of this is that like, you kind of have to let whatever happens happen, right? And this is for me a place where I can't be attached to outcomes, because even if I want to, so we could go about like, hey, I'm going to convene these people and I'll put money on the table so that they're compensated for their time. And if I say I'm bringing you together so that you can build trust, that is not a trustful process. That is not right. It has to come from the community. It has to come from them. And so what is our role in even convening is like that. I see it as like, we are an enabler. We can respond to asks. But I think, and we can test, right? We can test if there's readiness, and we can ask questions and provide resources and provide the connections, and sort of and share our vantage point. But I think that I think our role is really to listen, to respond, and to provide the resources that we are being asked for, particularly when it comes to wanting to build trust. But I think for some of the long-term systemic work we want to do, setting the table is really important, and making sure that we are moving at the pace of inclusion, right? And like, we as a funder are not the ones to define what that is, right? It is like the people at the table that are defining when they are ready to move forward and whether they've reached inclusion. We can provide incentives to do this, but it is a very tricky dance. And one that we are continuously learning to do and are I think, having conversations, I'll give a very explicit example. Because even if we are just being the respondents, it still can be a mistake, right? So we recently had a big organization, a big institution come to us and say, we want to do this community initiative. And we were like, this is amazing. It's going to create so many jobs. It's going to create focus on Black and Brown residents in these key neighborhoods. And we thought it was wonderful. As we began due diligence, and it was a really big ask, we realized that the partners that were on this proposal had not been communicated with. And so this was and that was because we had relationships with the partners. And so we just casually asked, hey, like, what do you think about this? How are you excited? What else is on here? And they're like, we don't know anything about that. And so that we felt like, okay, now we have a different role to step into, right? And to model what it's like to do inclusive work this way. And to provide resources and capacity building to ensure a table was really being set. And that this project was going to be co-designed with the partners. And so I think there isn't a playbook, but I think we've got to be willing to respond and move and be flexible with how we do the work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. I think that was a great example of how you build trust, because you're communicating and you're making sure that everyone is a part of this particular process, and it's not the funder that is driving it. And I think that's absolutely important. And then, Francis, I'm going to ask you a similar question, but with that word fear. How do we, from your perspective, alleviate the fear of engaging? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll answer it from a couple different perspectives. I think one, from like funders, what are funders afraid of? I think it's loss of control. Losing the ability to decide, to dictate, right? I think it is, when you think about all the institutions that have been built up, the size of different philanthropies, all the folks that are being employed, what are those folks going to do if we actually move philanthropy in the ways that we've been talking to, where it's more about trust-based, right? What it means that all of our jobs are then to be facilitators, right? Mm-hmm. Like I go back to what I always say, like the best ideas are outside of new schools, not inside new schools, but our job is to facilitate and provide support to those courageous leaders who are doing the hardest work, right? So then what does that mean about me, right? So the fear is also, it's a direct attack at ego, right? That you don't have the best ideas necessarily, right? So it's a fundamental reorientation to the work and how you think about yourself in that work, right? It is not about me. Mm-hmm. It is about the students we seek to serve in education. It is about the educators, the leaders who are doing that best work. So lots of fear in that. If I truly believe that we need to shift to more trust-based philanthropy, that I actually have a smaller role to play or a different role to play. And then what does that mean about my value, right? But I think that's especially challenging when if you're saying that to folks who control the capital, right? And so lots to explore there, right? It's your capital, but you should decide less, right? And that I think is the inherent tension in philanthropy, right? We're asking those who have the capital to direct it differently where they don't get to decide, but it is their money and there's no accountability, right? For how that money gets allocated, right? So we are relying on people to do the work, to go on the learning journey, to consider approaching the philanthropy in a different way. And that is a tall and huge ask. Ooh. I think the other thing, yeah. And we're also asking people to consider the experiences of others who are unlike themselves, like truly put yourself in the shoes of other people. And to imagine that the way in which your life has played out is not the way it plays out for other people because of racism, because of sexism, because of capitalism, right? And so that is a huge jump. And it goes back to where Lindsay started us, right? In terms of the learning journey that you have to be willing to go on to open your mind, right?
Yeah.
But I think the other thing about fear, which is I think about how we're doing the work, like I think a question I'm constantly asking myself is, how do we play bigger than how we're playing right now? But to truly play bigger, it also requires us, and we've been talking about elements of this, to really think about the coalition building and the fact that we are not in competition with other people, but each one of us needs the other so that we can all take on our unique part. I play a unique role. I'm not going to play anybody else's role, but you can count on me to do a certain set of things, right? We can count on Lindsay to do the radical stuff of like the risky things that no one else wants to invest in, or the more quote unquote radical things, right? But what is our unique roles? How do we divide it all up? And then how do we come together in coalition building where it's not about competition, but it's like actually us coming together to make more is more, but we don't know how to do that. And one of the things I'm most worried about right now in terms of the kind of progressive movement is that we have turned inwards on ourselves and we are applying all kinds of purity tests to see who's woke or who's the wokest or who's with it the most, right? To decide who's going to be in or out of the coalition. And I actually think we need to be in this moment where we're saying we want everybody in here doing their part, for the benefit of deeper equity work. And that's the part that I want to see. How do we get toward more of that so that we actually turn our attention to the true people that we need to move and change, right? And so that's another thing. I think there's I don't know if it's quite fear, but we are worried that we won't get the resources we need. We worry we won't get the attention on our own organizations and our particular way of driving change. And again, there's a fear of decentering ourselves in all of this. And I think that's a bigger thing of like, how do we truly move all this work in coalition and partnership with others?
You said a lot of deep stuff. And before we turn it back over to Xiomara, I did have one final question, and maybe we can take 15 to 20 seconds. We talked a little bit in front of the conversation about burnt out. And you just talked, Francis, about all of the isms that is causing the angst that we're experiencing. Just 15 to 20 seconds. Margarita, I'm going to ask you to go first. Tell me, how do you practice self-care?
Well, I am on a journey to date myself again, with my husband's, support, and I am taking ceramics classes, and I take myself out to dinner beforehand.
Beautiful.
No, yeah.
That's beautiful. Francis?
Yeah, I love that. I was like, I want to start dating myself too.
Right.
She's kind of cool, right? No. For me, I'm a practicing essentialist, which means I'm trying to focus in like what is my on the topics and the things that are like my highest purpose and use. Those are the things I say yes to, and then saying no to everything else. And what I've noticed is that I have defined myself by doing. And when I'm not doing as much, right? Like I'm like, oh, therefore people around me can't love me, or I'm not succeeding, blah, blah. So I'm actively uncoupling doing with success and allowing rest to come into my life. So saying no a lot more. Prioritizing rest. So I have my on the weekends, like my morning ritual of like, this is the time when no one's going to talk with me. And then I'm actively doing kind of acupuncture right now to kind of focus more on stress and wellness generally.
You have way more, you obviously don't have fear, because acupuncture, those needles are not my thing.
They don't hurt, but you got to get to the point where you know that they don't actually hurt, and don't look at them. Don't look at them.
Okay. Lindsay, I'll give you the final word and then we'll call on Xiomara.
Yeah, again, I think I'll go a little bit higher. We really turn to Audre Lorde and other ancestors for definitions around self-care that are not about kind of individual things, but more a whole orientation and way of being. At Threshold, we use Ron McKinley's 4 Rules of a Foundation to guide our work. So our role as a grant maker, our role as an economic entity, where's our money invested, who are our vendors, contractors, consultants, et cetera. Our role as a community actor, again, how are we actively thinking about power and our role and responsibility in organizing within philanthropy? And then finally, our role as an employer. And so our orientation is we can prevent burnout. We actually don't even need it to get to this point. And we take our role as an employer as seriously as our role as a grant maker. And so we're actually on an organization-wide sabbatical right now. So we all have July through December off of this year. And it's all of us at the same time, not just the co-CEOs, not just, the folks with more positional power and authority. And so we moved a year's worth of funding in 6 months. And the idea is we're trying to align ourselves more intuitively with nature. Nature rests. Nature knows there's a time to plant, there's a time to, reap, harvest, sow, all of that. But there is also a time to rest. And so again, it's building it into every aspect of our own organization. And then kind of opening that up and being really transparent with our partners around that too, to try to normalize this. We have a 4-day work week, right? Like we do all these things, but we try not to think of it as an individual thing each one of us is doing, and more as a part of our whole selves. How are we building this into our institution? And the last thing I'll say is we don't have a professional development budget. We have a holistic development budget. And literally folks can say, this is what I need in order to further evolve into my purpose and the person I'm meant to be. And that's not been conferences, y'all. It's not been trainings. It's not been books. If it is, go sit on a beach by yourself for a week, we pay for it. And so again, I think it's a shift around self-care, because honestly, I think we've really leaned into a very white supremacy way of thinking about self-care, which is go spend money on this product or go do this thing, instead of the kind of mental shift that Francis, you just alluded to, around capitalism only wants to think of ourselves as our labor. And self-care is truly thinking about who we are holistically beyond our doing and our earning and our jobs.
Thank you. Well, that was amazing. Thank you so much. Xiomara, I'm going to call you back on. We're over by 1 minute, but I think it was worth it. It was absolutely worth it. So Xiomara, do you want to quickly come on?
I just want to say a quick thank you. Y'all are badasses. Darlene, Margarita, Francis, Lindsay, I cannot thank you enough. To be fully and completely honest, my own act of restoration, or one of them in these times, has been putting together this discussion series to find connection and inspiration and to amplify voices and work of some deeply talented, wildly brilliant friends and colleagues out here fighting toward justice in our bodies in this time. So thank you very much, truly, so deeply appreciate it. And to all of you who took a beat from your day, thanks for joining us. Please keep this very same time slot held for next week, next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. We're moving into a discussion about what it looks like to localize strategies for creative maladjustment to keep equity work moving forward when you lead a cross-regional organization. So Heather Harding, who's the CEO from the Campaign for Our Shared Future, is going to facilitate a discussion with Jean-Claude Brazard, who's the CEO from Digital Promise, and Kira Orange-Jones, who's the CEO from Teach Plus. It promises to be another phenomenal discussion, so please join us next week. And thank you.